So I was thinking about Ephesians 4, where I left off in the section where Paul says that God has appointed apostles and prophets and pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, right? And for the communication of the gospel and building others up in the gospel. And I was thinking about the truth of the gospel and how necessary it is for us, how much we need it to combat the lies in our own minds, the lies that come from within us, and then the lies that come at us from outside of us, from other false teachers or even people who maybe unknowingly are just spreading lies. And so we need truth, and one of the things that we need to know most in life, that's most important, is that we would know the truth regarding God's character, God's heart. And I found myself on vacation reading Luke 15, so I'm going to have you turn there. Luke 15, it's the parable of the prodigal son, and I developed this message kind of on the fly as I was reading through it. Developed this message I'm going to call the prodigal, the prude, and the heart of God. The prodigal, the prude, and the heart of God. We'll play on words there, but I think it's so important because this passage helps us to understand with clarity what God is really like, and you can't even begin to estimate how valuable it is to know who He really is and what He's really like. And I found myself thinking about it. After I read it, we ended up driving around Pennsylvania where Jill's, hey Patrick, good to see you, where Jill's parents live. And you know Pennsylvania, some of you have visited there, others haven't, but it's the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. So riding around, so there are two things you see. One, you see rolling hills everywhere, and two, you see churches everywhere. There are so many churches in Pennsylvania. It's kind of like the Bible Belt of the North in a way. They're just everywhere, and lots of different religious sects, and you also have Amish and the Mennonites, and just the whole variety, smorgasbord of different religious people and people groups out there. So I'm thinking about, all of the like cultural Christianity. Another thing I should throw out there is, as I'm driving around, I'm flipping through radio stations, and there are countless Christian radio stations. And so I was reminded of how Christianity has developed its own culture, and there are different denominations and different groups and different subgroups and everything else, but there's also this kind of general, broad cultural Christianity in our country. And so I'm thinking about Luke 15 and what it reveals about the heart of God, and I'm thinking about what it says about the prodigal son, the younger son, and the older son, I'm going to call the prude. I still feel like there can be confusion regarding just who is God. If you cut through all of the surfacey manifestations of the church buildings and Christian radio and Christian institutions and all that other stuff, and you just get down to the nitty-gritty of who is God, what is God like. Places like Luke 15 are incredibly helpful for us seeing God clearly and seeing Him through the fog that can be created in religious environments. Especially in religious environments, there's a particular type of danger there that's not as obvious in the irreligious world. So again, to get to that, to spend some time thinking about that, I think will be helpful in Luke 15. All right? Let me read a couple verses in the prior context just to set it up, and then I want you to read with me, and we're going to make observations together. You're going to participate this morning, so I hope you're awake. I'm going to find my marker. Where did I put it? This is it. I'm going to have you make some observations with me and jot some things on the board here, and we're just going to learn together about the heart of God by looking at how God viewed and treated these two, in the parable, how the father viewed and treated these two sons that represent two forms of rebellion, two forms of godlessness. All right, so Luke 15, to give a couple contextual points here, in the beginning of the chapter, it says, "Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him," that is near Jesus, to listen to him. "Both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" So right away you see two people groups. There's Jesus teaching, communicating, and you have the tax collectors and the sinners, and they're listening to him. And you have the Pharisees and the scribes, and they're listening to him. And so you've got these two people groups. And then he goes from there into these other parables. Before you get to the prodigal son, you have the parable, let's see here, of the 99 sheep and the one that's lost. And the shepherd goes after the one lost sheep. And then you have the parable of the lost coin. A woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. And if she loses one, doesn't she light her lamp and go looking for it, right? And so it's that idea of like going after the lost. So that's the context of it. And then in the same setting, Jesus begins to tell this parable, which has historically been called the parable of the prodigal son. All right, so let's read verses 11 through 19 for starters. Let's just start with 11 through 19 and focus first on some observations regarding the prodigal. We've got some other young people joining us. Good morning, Juliana Pierce. Can you guys open to Luke 15, okay? We're in Luke 15. I'm going to have you help me, so you're going to participate this morning. All right, Luke 15. Who wants to read verses 11 through 19 for me? Volunteer?
I will.
Go ahead, Matt.
And he said, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me. So he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread? But I am dying here with hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. All right, so we're introduced to the prodigal son, the younger son, first. What, in your observation, what was just read there as you're looking at your Bibles, what seems to be motivating him? What does he seem to want, the prodigal? What's he seem to want?
Pleasure now.
Okay. Yep. Pleasure now. Immediate gratification, right?
Autonomy.
Okay, so we use the word that we've been using constantly lately. Autonomy.
Something different.
Something different? Something different from what, Ryan?
From what he has right then.
Something different from what he has right then. And what did he have right then?
Father.
Okay, so he had his father, and he's living in a household, and, there's certain, whatever you call it, rules and standards in the household or whatever, a certain culture in the household, certain expectations probably. We know from the way this develops and the sort of imagery here that there's like work to be done. And so he's in that context, and he wants something different. And as Matt said, if you're going to boil it down, he wants a form of pleasure, like immediate gratification. And so he goes out and he finds that pleasure. It says that he squandered his estate with loose living. First he had to plead with his father to give him the inheritance early, right? So he wanted the resources to be able to go out there and please himself. And the father obliged him, gave him the resources, and he went out there, and that's exactly what he did, right? And it says what happened once he was out there for a while, enjoying his loose living, and no doubt experiencing some pleasure. What eventually happens to him?
Failed.
Okay, it failed. He failed. He failed. Okay.
His effort to make it on his own.
Okay, his effort to make it on his own failed, and he found himself in what state? No resources. Go ahead, Greg.
California.
He found himself in California, Southern California specifically, right? Yeah, right. Bankrupt state, and yeah. Go ahead, Mikhail, did you say something?
Poor and starving.
Yeah, poor and starving, and there's this where he is. There's this like, was there like a famine? And he says like the whole country, the whole area was impoverished, and so he went and had to hire himself out, and he found himself in a non-desirable job feeding swine, right? I mean, and it's like this imagery that just depicts, I mean, the lowest of low places.
He wanted to eat, he was so starving, he wanted to eat their food.
Yeah.
He's on the pig race.
Not just tending to pigs, but actually having to eat with pigs. So he's kind of in this, I mean, disgusting place, and he's found himself now in this dehumanized, awful, dreadful place. Okay, so this is what he wanted, and where all that got him was it got him in the, you know, living with the pigs, right? How do you spell sty? Pig sty. How do you spell sty? Anybody know? Oh, I got two different answers out there. Is it S-T-I or S-T-Y?
S-T-Y-I-E-S.
I-E-A. Let's go with that. Who knows what it really is? Someone can Google it. But he found himself there, poor, ashamed, and what occurs to him when he's in that state? What sort of epiphany does he have?
This is my servants in my father's house have it better than this.
Yeah. Yeah. So it says, he came to his senses, and literally in the original language, he came to himself, like he kind of like, you know, when you say, hey, someone wasn't himself, or she wasn't herself. I mean, he came to himself, and he said, how many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger. So I'm famished, empty, and my father and his household is a place of abundance and provision. And he says, I'm gonna go back, and I'll say to him, like basically, I'll plead with him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm in verse 18 now. And then verse 19, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. Like, look, I'll be happy to just get back in. If you just let me in, you can treat me like a slave. That's fine, but I've got to get back. This is awful. I mean, what at first appealed to him and seemed to dangle before him the promise of pleasure and fulfillment and improvement from where he was, different from where he was, right? Much better than where he was. Once he got there and spent some time there and engaged in loose living, he found himself empty, he found himself desperate, and he had to get back. So he goes back to the Father. And of course, you know, we're gonna end on this heart of God. So we're going to have to move ahead a little bit, but you remember, just in summary, I mean, he goes back and the Father welcomes him back, right, and throws a party for him. And shows him this amazing grace. I love Pastor Tim Keller, pastor and author Tim Keller. You've heard me mention him many times. He has a great little book called The Prodigal God, and he plays off of the term prodigal, because when you hear prodigal, I mean, what do you think of when you hear that word? What does it mean? Wicked, bad person, right? Person who engages in loose living and is licentious, maybe it would be a word. Really, the word has to do with like one who spends lavishly, like almost reckless spending. And so he calls it the prodigal God because he interprets God here in this passage as being the one who gives so freely, in a way, gives grace out recklessly to this younger son. So we'll get to that more. We'll say more about that. But let's talk a little bit about the Prude. All right. So we've made some observations about the prodigal here. Let's go to the Prude. Oh, and by the way, before we go there, remember the audience back in verse 1 and 2. So we said there are two groups listening to Jesus. So which would be the group that would most quickly identify with the prodigal, or that we could identify with the prodigal? The tax collectors and sinners, okay? And just what do you know about tax collectors? Traitors. Thieves.
Cheated.
Go ahead, Matt.
They would cheat.
Cheaters.
More taxes than people.
They would inflate the taxation on people just to get more for themselves. They were and this is what you're alluding to, but a lot of times they were Jewish people who went and worked for the Roman government, so that's why they were considered traitors. I mean, they were scoundrels, right? But from the perspective of a normal Jewish person who is staying within their bounds as a citizen of Rome, but also loyal to their people group, they would view these tax collectors as complete traitors, right? Sellouts. And to make matters worse, these same traitors, not only did they abandon their people and loyalty to their people, but they actually were gouging their people. So, I mean, these are not likable people, all right? And then sinners, of course, a broad term, but just, okay, these are the obvious, messed up, screwed up people. And then you have the Pharisees, right? And the scribes are mentioned. The scribes are the ones who are responsible for recording and copying the text of Scripture and safeguarding Scripture and all of that. And so now we have the older son, and if the younger son would more readily be identified with the tax collectors and sinners, who would the older son more readily be identified with? With the Pharisees and the scribes, right? So let's make some observations about the older son that we're calling the Prude. All right. For starters, what do you know about the Pharisees and scribes? I mean, if you were to, I don't know, summarize what you know about them, what would you say?
They have a superiority complex.
Okay, superiority complex in what sense?
They felt
Based on what?
They felt they were pleasing God in every way. They tithed the commandments and, letter of the law.
Letter of the law. Saw themselves as dedicated to God more so than other people.
Checked all the boxes.
Checked the boxes.
They were viewed with respect, I think, by the people as the ones that
Right.
they wanted to be like, they should be like.
Right. In our minds, we have a negative connotation, but for the most part, back then, as I understand it, most people respected them highly. They were the devout, and if the you want your kids to be like those people, right? You want them to grow up and be successful Pharisees.
But they loved all that attention, the long prayers and all that stuff
Right.
in public.
Yeah, Jesus talks about in other places how they love to pray long, flowery, impressive prayers, and they love, the attention, the honor, the praise of men, and all that. But culturally, they were highly esteemed and would be viewed as the sort of put together people. I mean, if the tax collectors and sinners, and to use the imagery of the parable, if the prodigal is a complete mess and a disaster, and it's obvious that he's a mess and disaster, then what's the older son look like? What do the Pharisees and scribes look like? They look like they've got it together, right? They look
faithful.
They look good.
The faithful.
They're the faithful ones.
Certainly not working with pigs.
Yeah, not working in the pigsty, right? I mean, probably fine dining and have it together. All right. So let's read verses 25 through 30. Like I said, we're skipping a little bit. We'll come back to it. We're skipping a little bit of that party, but after the party is thrown and the older son discovers what's happening, let's read this. Verse 25 through 30. Can someone read that for me?
Now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. And he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, "Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf, because he has received him back safe and sound." And he became angry and was not willing to go in, and his father came out and began pleading with him. But he answered and said to his father, "Look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours. And yet you have never given me a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him."
Okay. It says in verse 25 that the older brother that Greg just finished reading about was out in the field. What do you think he was doing out in the field? So if this guy's at pleasure now, we would say, well, it's like a delayed gratification. This guy's working.
So I'd say he's fulfilling his role and responsibility.
Okay.
Whatever that is.
Fulfilling. And we don't know if he's in a management role or whatever. It doesn't matter. He's out there functioning, right? Productive.
Doing what is expected of him.
Doing what's expected. Okay. When he hears the party, or he observes that this party is happening, what is his response? Say it again.
Anger.
Say anger. Okay. So, in response to the party, he is angry. Any other words you could add?
Sounds a little bitter to me.
Bitter. And what does he say? Someone read again what he says. What's he say?
You're a kid.
I've been doing this, and I've done this, and you never treated me this way. There's my party.
Yeah, he says, hey, for so many years I've been serving you, working, right? And I've never neglected a command of yours. I mean, that's significant right there. Again, to tie it to the audience, the Pharisees, the scribes, right? They were diligent about their observance of these commands, right? I've never neglected a command. I'm doing I've done all the right things. And you've never thrown me a party like this. I'm just working, sweating. And this jerk comes home after basically, I mean, in a way, kind of robbing his father of the inheritance because he demanded it early. Saying, this complete reckless selfishness, obvious, abject selfishness. He does that. He comes home and you throw him a party. And I'm out here slaving away, never neglecting a command. You never gave me a young goat, so I might celebrate with my friends.
Well, it's interesting too, right there, that he's out in the field, like the party's going on. It's like he's not even invited to the party. I just realized that.
Well, I mean, but he is. He is. Because look, you see what the Father says. But I mean, can you understand and appreciate why he's ticked off?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, whose inheritance is now paying for the party?
If the younger has already been given what's due him, then what's left?
Right.
So in a sense, it's costing him too. I mean, you just add insult to injury. It just gets worse and worse from a human perspective if you put yourself in his shoes.
He's arguing the father's being unjust. I think it's not fair.
This is not fair. Remember, Jesus tells the parable of the workers elsewhere, where he says, hey, look, people are out there slaving away since early in the morning, and they've agreed to work for a certain wage, and then some clown shows up at like 4:30 in the afternoon, and he starts working, and at the end, the supervisor pays him all the same. That's not fair. No one would be okay with that. Just for fun, I'm not going to go down this path, but just for fun. I mean, throughout human history, I'll just say most political conflicts, to include the one that's happening right now, at one level, it has to do with the haves and the have-nots. I mean, it's always that. It's always like fighting for stuff in this world, right? Real estate stuff, the means of production, whatever, right? I mean, there's all sorts of aspects of that. Power over the stuff, I mean, whatever, right? But, I mean, it's just like a common, fundamental, like, human issue. And it has been, and it will be. And he is understandably the prude that is not happy. And look, if you, just for fun, I mean, if you're going to hang out and try to have a good time, who would you rather hang out with, this guy or that guy? In a sense, I think I want to say neither, but maybe more so this guy. He'd probably at least laugh a little bit with this guy. This guy, not so much. Pretty uptight, right? Interesting. So, can you identify with, let's go back for a minute. Can you identify with this guy at all at certain seasons in your life? Maybe right now in some ways. I mean, can you identify with this guy? Hey, can I just get a little pleasure, please? And I don't know how long I'm going to live. All I know is I got right now. Can I just make the most of it right now? Can you give me my money now so I can enjoy it now? Because I don't know what the future's going to hold. And frankly, I don't feel like working and doing all this junk that my brother does all the time. That seems boring as heck to me. I don't want to do that. I just want to have some fun.
It's like, we'll just not have drama. Can we just sail through?
Okay, can you identify with this guy? We already said, I mean, most of us were nodding, saying, especially when it comes to viewing the prodigal, it's like, oh yeah, I can totally identify with all this.
Oh, yeah. I'm ticked off with that guy.
Yeah.
You also think like this, the Prude guy,
Yeah.
you're like picking up the slack of the younger brother too. I mean, when someone's missing in our family, Addie goes to work, we're not doing Addie's job. So
Yeah.
it's Addie, right? So like we notice when a kid is missing, everybody has assigned work to do in our house.
Right.
And when one of them is not around, we're picking up their slack. There's a lot of grumbling about it.
Yeah.
I can imagine this brother, before he took off, probably had responsibilities. Maybe the Prude's out there even doing his stupid job that he was
Yeah.
supposed to do.
Picking up his slack. And the whole time thinking, you jerk, I can't, I'm just seething, right? I mean, look, we just got off vacation for 2.5 weeks. You guys know?
I'd like to talk to you about that.
We talk about that?
Taking a vacation.
Yeah, how dare I? But the funny thing is, we did have a blast. But even like when you're on vacation, you know, if you have a family, you got kids, like if people are going to survive, like you still need to work. You need to hunt and gather and do all that, right? You still need to make meals and clean up after and keep, you know, at the last, you know, for years. I'm looking forward to when we get to the point where it's not all or largely about keeping our children alive. A lot of times just keeping them alive. There's work to be done, right? That's welcome to earth. And there's something within us that says, I just don't want any responsibility. I just want to go have fun and just glut myself just to test the theory out. I forgot what it's even like to live this way. Maybe just test it out. Maybe it is awesome. Something in us says that, right? Even if we've learned in previous chapters of our lives that you end up here. But still, it's like it's enticing, right? It's still to some degree. So we can identify with this guy, and we can identify with this guy. I mean, so this guy's obviously not doing the right things. This guy seems to be doing the right things. But underneath it all, what's motivating this guy? So let's focus in on this guy again a little bit more, the Prude here. What is underneath? Why is he angry and bitter and saying this is not fair?
Because he's trying to seek his inheritance by work.
Because what does he want? He wants the pleasure of the inheritance too, right? He wants the inheritance.
But he's following the steps to get it, though.
And the pleasure, he's just following the formula that's been outlined as he understands it in order to get it. Trying to earn it.
I think that's the interesting thing about when, like in verse 7, with the prodigal, it says, but when he came to himself, it's like he finally realizes the truth about himself and his father.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's right. It's like the light bulbs come on, right? For this guy, and we don't see him in the story, we don't read or learn about him having an epiphany of the same kind. And it probably fits with elsewhere where Jesus says, hey, look, it's the tax collectors, it's the prostitutes who come to me more quickly than the Pharisees. Like, they get it more easily. Like, they can understand better the nature of grace because they realize how much they don't deserve it, whereas this guy is still so focused on what he thinks he deserves. Did either one of them really value the Father? I mean, they just did it. And this guy may seem to because on the outside he's the obedient, compliant one, but he really did it. He wanted the stuff too. He just had a different methodology. He's had a different way of going about it.
It's just like the prodigal son, he wanted something different than he was getting.
Right.
But he says, you didn't, you know.
And he was exercising the delayed gratification approach of eventually I'm going to get it. And I'm doing what I'm doing for that day. He's saving for that future time, right? But again, to talk about what they valued and what they prized, it really was not the Father in relationship with him. It just wasn't. Go ahead, Greg.
So it said of the prodigal that he squandered his inheritance, so he really didn't appreciate what the Father had set aside for him.
Yeah.
And the son says, hey, you never killed a calf for me, but Dad probably could go back through and say, you know how much groceries were this week?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like I feed you. Okay? I provided for you. So I think that both of them had not really appreciated the Father and his gifts.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah,
I also
very
have a
true.
question about a guy that would say, I've never, ever trespassed against you. Ever. You know? I think he believes that,
Right.
but he's not Jesus.
Right. And it doesn't mean he may believe that, but it doesn't mean it's true
He may have even functionally done it, like.
on the outside. I mean, Paul says, hey, look, I kept the law. In places he says that. In other places he makes it clear, well, but I really didn't, right? So it depends on how you look at it. But he probably felt like he was. So before we look at the Father, we're going to go back to that middle section, and then we're going to look at the words that the Father says at the end of it too. But before we do that, how does life, just to kind of remind ourselves, how does life tend to go for this guy? What's it tend to look like from the outside looking in? Mess, right? I mean, for a season it might look fun, exciting, whatever, but I mean, at some point, I mean, it's a disaster, right? Okay. And how does life tend to look from the outside looking in when you're looking at this guy? How does it tend to look? Together, upright, organized, responsibility, again, productivity, right? This guy has money in the bank. This guy is in debt up to his ears. This guy's family, at least on the outside, looks like it's intact. This guy is obviously, he's been divorced 3 times, and it's obviously a mess. I mean, you get the idea, right? Okay. All right, so let's consider now the heart of the Father over these 2 sons, okay? So go to, let's start at verse 20, and I'll read this and just hear it, and then let's make some observations about the Father. So this is now backing up in the story. The prodigal son is coming home. And he's determined, hey, I just want to get back in my father's house. I'm happy to be a slave there. I just want to be there. I want to be with my father and in his house and under his care again. Because that's true life. Verse 20. So he got up and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him. I mean, let's stop there for a second. The father sees him coming and felt, what did he feel for him? Compassion. He felt compassion for the empty, poverty, all the other stuff, the guilt, the shame. I mean, all that we could list here. I mean, the father knew all that garbage and felt compassion. Even though underneath it was rebellion against the father, the same father has compassion for that rebellious son. And it says, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. And culturally, as I understand it, for someone to run, and of course they were wearing those tunics back then, so he had to hike up his tunic, and for an older man to do that was considered kind of like a shameful thing. So he embarrasses himself in a way, pursuing his son. And he embraces him quickly, and he kisses him, which again tells you that he had compassion, he had love for his son, even though his son had betrayed him. He had never betrayed his son. He had never turned his back on his son. I mean, you get the idea that it's like he was looking for him, like every day, hoping he would come back. And it says he embraced him, he kissed him. And the son said to him, being, I'm sure, overwhelmed with gratitude and being softened by the response of his father toward him, the son says, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, quickly, bring out the best robe and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf, kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and he's come to life again. He was lost and he's been found. And they began to celebrate. So this heart of grace toward the prodigal. Grace, I'll just put compassion here too. Compassion, grace. With the imagery of the parable, there's this party, this celebration, which, by the way, just for fun, throwing out there, like God is not a party pooper, like contrary to what this form of religion would tell you, he's not. So he throws this party, this big celebration. There's great joy and rejoicing and great pleasure. This is Psalm 16:11. In your presence there is pleasure. I'm butchering it, but at your right hand there's pleasure. And it's like this idea of when you're with God, like there's pleasure, there's joy in that relationship. And they're experiencing it as the story goes. And then you go down to the father's response to the older son. And let's pick it up verse 29 so we get the idea again of what the older son is thinking. Look, for so many years I've been serving you and have never neglected a command of yours, and yet you've never given me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured, let me just remind you, Father, of what this jerk did, who devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him? And he said to him, this is the father saying now to that son, to the prude, Son, you've always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. I mean, I hear compassion here as well, and grace. Do you hear what he said? I mean, you've always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. I mean, first of all, there's this. You've always been with me. There's relationship. You're here. I'm here with you. You're here with me. The greatest value is relationship. And all that is mine is yours. And you get the idea. I mean, this father is not, he's not like middle class, like lower middle class, maybe upper middle. I mean, this guy has a lot. You've got plenty. You're not lacking. You've got me, and you got everything that belongs to me, belongs to you. Like, you got everything you need. Don't, like... He says, but we had to celebrate, rejoice. For this brother of yours, so you see the son, the brother says of his younger brother, hey, your son, that son of yours, and he says, hey, the brother of yours, hey, guess what, bud? You guys are both my sons. You're both each other's brothers. Ready? There's no moral high ground for this guy. He thought there was, but there wasn't. His heart was just as black as this guy. We had to celebrate. We had to rejoice. This is what I do. This is what I'm like. I'm a gracious father. I love my kids. I want them home with me. I want the celebration. And you just come in. You can come in too, and let's party. The only thing keeping you from the party right now is your attitude. So, in my own life, and with countless people I counsel, and sure, as we said earlier, you can identify with both these two sons. I mean, there is a version of Christianity which I would argue, I believe, is pretty prevalent in our country and probably around our world that really kind of fits more with this. That looks like this. And that's why people are ready to just abandon it when just the family didn't work out. Things didn't go as planned. The kid abandoned me. This happened, that happened. I mean, things just didn't go the way I wanted them to go with my church, with this, with that, whatever. And it's like this, I was working, I was fulfilling my role and responsibility, I was doing what was expected. And then when you hear like such people, including myself, address issues that take place relationally or whatever, it's like there's this condescension with regard to people who are more in this camp. And it seems to be a justifiable condescension because I know more, I'm more responsible, I'm doing more, I'm more productive, and it's just oozing with just pride. And it has nothing to do with who God really is. And you would think sometimes when you hear like ministry and missional thinking and all that, like the point is to get these people over to here. Because that's not the point. The point is who is God? Who loves his kids, who sees us all like, I don't know, I mean I do it all the time, but like when we're chastising people on other sides of political issues or whatever because they're reckless and this and that, and look, there's still, we all have an obligation, a responsibility in terms of how we handle things that go on in society and how we interpret them and how we vote and all that. Like that's very important, but I'm just talking about like the underlying thinking that determines the tone and tenor of it all. It comes from these deep places of what we really want. Right? And the Father is just observing and has open arms and open invitation and has a party in store for all of his children and is through Christ has made provisions for us to know his compassion and his grace and to be with him. Remember the way the eons ago we were talking about, death, right? Spiritual death, and to be apart from God, to be without God. And then the gospel, the good news of Christ is that we've been united with God. We're with God. We're with him, and all that is his is ours. We've been seeing this in Ephesians. Everything in Christ we have, right? Every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places is ours in Christ. And we wait to see it. We wait to see it. But the reality is we already have it. We're already seated there. We're already at the party from the perspective of God. And so there's I don't know, I just think again as I was contemplating my understanding, my experience now being a Christian for, I don't know, over 2 decades and being in ministry for close to that long. I believe it's easy to lose sight of the heart of the Father, and it's easy to get caught up in either one of these mentalities, but there's a Father who's like watching, who's pursuing, who's inviting, who's welcoming, who is celebrating, and that's powerful, and that goes way deeper than any of the forms and physical manifestations and icons and relics of religion that just litter our world and so often distract from who God really is. Last thing I'll say is, you know what it's like when, if you have kids or grandkids, and you hear one of your kids like condemning one of the other kids, and I've used this example a million times, but I just think it's so appropriate because it just betrays the same thing. It's like when you hear that dripping with condescension, which everyone is guilty of, and every kid does it to their sibling at some point, but when you hear that, you're hearing this guy, and then you hear, the accusations. This guy is capable of, hurling his own accusations too. But I mean, it's just human stuff. And Jesus is telling this parable to say, hey, here's who God is. And meanwhile, as he's speaking it, he's embodying the heart of God. He's actually bringing the heart of God to us. He's living in our place. He's dying in our place. He's offering full pardon, forgiveness, compassion, mercy to everybody. And everyone's undeserving. And what we have is of grace and not of our effort. So I wanted to share that with you. I think it's important. To me, it's clarifying. I don't know, any thoughts, questions?
Just think it's interesting how neither of the sons really understood their father's love. Like, I've heard just in the Jewish culture for the Pharisees how scandalous that would have been for the father to welcome the son back like that
Right.
after the life of sin, and how the son didn't even, like, he's maybe my father will take me out as a hired man, but just how amazing the father's love was
Yeah.
to him.
Yeah.
And then in some ways it feels like on the side of the Prude, like when we're operating in that, it's like, well, I gotta be good enough for God to be okay with me. I gotta keep doing it. Just the Father's mercy into the Prude, and that he's welcoming him, even though he's self-righteous, he thinks he's earned it, he really hasn't, but just the Father's compassion to both of them means so much bigger than what they
Yeah.
imagine. And I feel like that often describes us, regardless of what side we're on, just
Yeah.
how amazing he is and his mercies, more than they can imagine and more than we can.
Yeah, that's awesome. And there was a great point, Matt, too, about like the prodigal. From what he says, it shows his misunderstanding of his father's hard attitude, like his father's disposition toward him. Because he's thinking, "I'll just go back and be." It's like he's not expecting, in a way, the father to throw the party for him, to just give him so much lavishly like that. So what's that say about his understanding? Like he was misunderstanding the nature of the father, and the Prude, the same thing. I mean, he's misunderstanding the nature of the father too. They're both misunderstanding, minimizing the grace of God, mischaracterizing God, and we've been doing it from Adam and Eve forward. That's what we do. And so what God does is He reveals Himself, and we can be grateful for that, and then we can kind of stumble around apprehending that, even though we're not going to fully comprehend it until we're on the other side. But yeah, it's good. It's really good.
Yeah.
Other thoughts? Yeah,
I would
questions?
say it's kind of connected to what he was saying, but from maybe different angles. As you're reading it, the prodigal and his, I've always heard like he repents, he goes back to the father, and so therefore the father accepts him. But it seems like, as you now say, if you read this, he's very utilitarian. I mean, he's just trying to get again something different than what he has at that point, which is eating pig slop. Work with pigs. He just wants relief. So he goes back to the father just for relief from his circumstance.
Right.
There's no idea that he loves the father, but he's turning back to that. Where else is he going to go to live?
Yeah, that's a great point too. It's almost like being surprised by grace, right? And like, so the moment of his softening, when I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, happens as a result of the Father embracing him. He's like surprised by the embrace, right?
I've often, part of my journey was that God used Caroline to kind of awaken me to want to know Him. And my kind of turning to God late in college was very utilitarian. I didn't want to lose the girl. And I used to feel really guilty about that. Like, I didn't have this great change of heart that God did something. Same thing with Taiwan, which I shared. I didn't have this big change of heart that God did something good for me. Like, I was very utilitarian. I wanted to be with Caroline. And that's what, and so, and I think I see parallels there with me.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't like my heart had this great change. I just love Jesus.
Right. And that's why I'm a little suspicious of when that change seems to be, because I can look at seasons in my life and say, well, hey, that change took place where I went from not wanting Jesus to wanting Jesus and wanting that relationship. And that works until it doesn't sometimes. You think that's what you want, but time reveals that what you actually wanted was something different. You were negotiating for a certain, as you said, marriage, relationship, a certain family, a certain upright life, a certain whatever, right? And probably even unbeknownst to us sometimes, that's the way it is happening. But then time and experience reveals what we're really after and what our hearts are like. And so then you're even more compelled to say, hey, my hope is God and his pursuit of me, not my, because even my pursuit of him is mixed motives a lot of times. So Paul says, I don't even know my own heart, right? I can't even fully decipher what's in my own heart. But God sees it all clearly, and this is his commitment to me. And therein I rest, right? And the display of the heart of God is the most magnificent thing. This is what we are about. This is what we come to do every week. This is what we do when we meet during the week. Is the best thing that we do. We don't always do it, and we don't always do it well. But the best thing that we do is like we just together we behold who God is. We behold our God, right? Go ahead, Laura.
You know, I was brought up with not a whole lot of communication, but one thing that was communicated was pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So I can really relate to the Prude in regards to work ethic and responsibility and all of that. And something, it would not, you know, Jesus doesn't finish the story, but something that it would surprise me if the Prude can as easily recognize the love of the Father as the prodigal can, because at the base of that uber responsibility is fairness. Mm-hmm. It's also got to be fair. And this just isn't fair. And so long as the other son is there, it's going to continue to not be fair. You know, that's going to be a tough.
Yeah, and the only resolution for that, interestingly, because it makes perfect sense even as you say it, Laura, and I'm hearing it again. Like, when the focus is on the stuff, the payoff, the reward, whatever that is, it cannot seem fair. But if we can see that God himself is the payoff and we all get God, then it's all fair. The problem is we're just not convinced that he's that valuable. But he loves you anyway. And that is grace. And someday when we're home, we're going to finally, we get little glimmers of that. But someday we're home, we're going to see that fully and say, oh man, it's so good. It's okay.
Well, it seems like sometimes God's mercy for the Prude is like knocking them off the horse, like he did to Paul.
Yeah.
And saying,
Right.
all that righteousness is nothing.
Right.
And helping us.
Right.
The extremely painful but gracious taking our stuff away. Or helping us to see.
That's very true. Yep. Very true. All right, very good. All right, guys, I hope that was encouraging to you. Let's pray and start our service. Let's pray. God, thank you for this time we've had this morning. Thank you for bringing the Pierce family back safely here and the things we've been able to talk about. Thank you for a glimpse at your heart in this study of Luke 15 this morning. Help us, God, to see you more clearly and to experience encouragement, comfort, relief, even the excitement of celebration. And we look forward to that day. And just give us clarity, God, discernment regarding our own hearts, and help us to interpret things going on in our world, and help us to move forward in light of who you are. And thank you for your commitment to revealing yourself to us.